Hey, it's Mr. Blake, and this is from my AP Human Geography course. This would have been what we were discussing back on Tuesday, which is the Gender Inequality Index, which is that collection of data that the United Nations collects um, in order to determine from country to country what is the level of inequality between the sexes. And as I said at the very beginning, there is no country where this does not exist at some point, where the status of women is usually in some sort of inferior position to the men. And so what they do is they collect all sorts of data to try to determine just what kind of disparity are we looking at. And so some of the things that they will look at are things like the maternal mortality rate, which is the number of women who die in the process of giving birth. And we tend to forget in post-industrial societies that have very high levels of technology that childbirth is a pretty serious procedure, and a lot of things can go wrong as a medical procedure. And so if you don't have that technology in place, oftentimes it would be a fatal thing for the mother. Throughout history, it has been one of the largest killers of women throughout history, is this process of childbirth. And if you think about women who live in countries with very high fertility rates, where there's an expectation of having multiple children, that means you have multiple times where this may be a fatal experience for you. So you have to think about it in terms like that. Why would you see a high mortality for mothers in perhaps developing countries? But then when you look at more developed countries, let's say the United States, we often will see that our maternal mortality rate is relatively high for countries that we would be grouped with, like our Japans or Western Europe or something like that. And so you have to ask yourself, what's the difference? Why would the United States have a higher maternal mortality rate than, let's say, the West Europeans or the Japanese or the Australians or whomever? And there's probably two things that we're looking at here. One, those countries tend to have socialized medical systems, and so everyone has access to health care. Whereas we in the United States tend to have private healthcare and private insurance. And so if you can't afford those things, there is a potential there that young mothers are not taking advantage of a lot of the health support that they might see in European countries or Japan or wherever else. And that would also require us spending that kind of money on maternal years, so that when a woman becomes pregnant, there's a lot of care that needs to be in place prior to the day of birth. The date of birth is again a very serious medical procedure, and then there's the support afterwards as well. And so if the money's not being spent for that, it may well be that that's going to increase your maternal mortality rate. And that may be something that we as Americans need to be looking at, as far as where we stand on the Gender Inequality Index, or the GII. Do you have access to reproductive services? Is another issue that is covered in the GII, looking at do women have access to birth control? And this is a very serious issue in many, many countries, where it is often very restricted as to what kind of family planning can a woman expect to be able to receive in her country. And again, this goes back to this idea of inequality, that what is the role of women in traditional society, which is to give birth, to produce children, to manage the house. And so if you don't have access to those things, then the chances are you are probably going to be doing those sort of traditional things. You're going to have children. That's going to make entering into the workforce a much more difficult thing to do for a woman as opposed to a man. And so that may be supporting that sort of gender inequality that you would see. Which brings me to things like representation in government. If you look at governments around the world, how many females take part in elective offices, become leaders of countries, and so forth? It's not that unusual around the world, especially in your more developed countries, that they have had women as the supreme executive of that country, be president or prime minister or whatever. Um, Not that unusual. Hasn't happened in the United States yet. And so we have to again ask ourselves that question. Why is it that we have not had a woman become president when women make up half the population of the United States? And then sometimes it gets worse if you look at it. If you look at representation in legislatures around the world. In some countries, like Iceland, it's actually required under their constitution that half of their legislative body be made up of women, so that the women are actually represented in government. In other places, you have almost no women serving in government in any sort of elective form, because that is not the role of women to decide things in society. Now, this is again more seen in traditional societies. You might see this more, let's say, in the Middle East, in places like Pakistan or Afghanistan, although I will point out Pakistan had a female leader at one point, too. So they're kind of ahead of us there. But it may well be that there is some cultural issues. Sorry, my lights just died on me. Um, about allowing women to actually serve in government. And we may have to ask ourselves, why is it that more women do not end up getting represented in United States government, in the U.S. Senate, let's say, or the House of Representatives? Why is that? Why are we not electing women? So that is one of the things that is looked at in the GII. Workplace is another thing. Women make up half of our population. So are they in the workplace? And if so, are they succeeding in the workplace? And one of the things I want to just draw to your attention is the fact that women have not been in the workplace outside of farming and home management in places like the United States until fairly recently. If you think about really women moved into the workplace at the beginning of the 20th century, that's barely over 100 years ago. And if you look at them really moving into places like in industry, doing construction and that sort of thing, that really doesn't start until about 70 years ago, so even less. Um, and so you have to ask yourself, well, why haven't we seen women rising to the head of companies like your IBMs or your Apples or whatever else? And they have in some, but the number of women serving as chief executives or high-ranking executives within companies around the world, it's not simply an American problem, is actually very small. And so we have to ask, why is that? Well, one of the things that may be holding that advancement for women in these companies is the fact that they are the sex that is expected to have children. And when you have children, it is often a case where you are going to leave the workforce for a while. Maybe you'll come back to it, but you've lost that time, haven't you? And so if you have let's say one child, you might be out of the workforce for 3 to 5 years. If you have multiple kids, you may be out for a considerable more amount of time, 10, 15 years. And that's going to adversely affect your ability to rise through these organizations like a company, and possibly within government as well. So that may be one of the things that has hindered women's progression in all sorts of professions. We are probably pretty aware that there's a pay disparity, that women often don't seem to get paid as much in the workforce. There could be lots of reasons for that. It depends on what jobs we tend to see as women's jobs versus men's jobs, and for whatever reason, the men's jobs seem to always get paid more. It could be the sort of sectors of the economy that women tend to be more represented in. For instance, public education. Most of your teachers are going to be women. And so You're probably aware that public school teachers don't get paid that very much, not in comparison to some sort of middle management job in some company. And so, if you have more women represented in that sector of the economy that doesn't pay as well, then that means that there's going to be a pay disparity when you look at it overall. So there may be a lot of reasons for that, but it is something that is tracked in the GII. How many women are in the workforce? What are they getting paid? And is there a disparity? And yes, there always is. It just depends on how bad a disparity it is. Schooling is another issue. How many years of schooling people get. In the United States, the public school system expects that citizens of the United States, regardless male or female, should have 12 years of public education. And that's good. And that is on par with what you would see around the world. But in many countries, that may not necessarily be the case, that education actually stops at the seventh grade level or the fifth grade level. They give you a basic education and then they expect you to go into the workforce. And unfortunately, there is often a huge disparity here in countries between men and women. Where the men may have 10 years of public education, that's an expectation of them, but the women only have 5. And the basic idea here, again, is you're probably looking at developing countries with very traditional societies and traditional roles for men and women. And that means that the education gets shorted on the women because they're not expected to go and work in the workforce. They're expected to get married, have kids, settle down in the house. And so they don't tend to get very much of an education, just very basic reading, writing, arithmetic, and that's pretty much it. And so when you look at educational disparities, there often is one between the sexes when you look at the amount of education that they get. And that will vary a great deal from country to country on what the expectations are. Also, the expectations for those students as to whether or not they're going to complete all those years of public education, which brings me to another thing that is tracked by the GII, which is your adolescent fertility rate. Adolescents, we're talking about teenagers. And so, how many of your teenagers are starting to have children while they're still teenagers? And if so, how many are they going to have through the rest of their life? So, when you look at the adolescent fertility rate, if you are having your young women becoming mothers at a much earlier age, there's probably a couple of things going on here. One, again, traditional societies, women tended to begin to produce families at a much earlier age. And so if you are in part of the developing world where you have that traditional role, that's what you're going to do. However, we also see it in terms of sometimes when we're looking at some of our societies around the world, are young women being put into the position where there's an expectation that they're going to begin to produce children before they become actual adults. And we see this in places like the United States. Again, we're a very developed country. We have all this technology. You would think that our adolescent fertility rate would be low, and it's not. And part of that, we think, has to do with that we have a very sexualized society, that we tend to use sex as a selling thing for everything. And so that if you're exposed to that at a very early age through technology, and we've got the TVs and the radios and the internet and everything else in the United States, that it's possible that that concept of sexuality is beginning earlier in a society where all that technology is available and it is being used that way. Tragically, one of the things that I know I've encountered is the idea that a lot of young ladies will begin to form these families, to start having children at a very young age, because they don't feel like anybody else really cares about them and doesn't love them. And so they want to produce something that will love them, which is a baby. And you see this in American culture. And it's a very sort of, to me, disturbing trend that we see. And that is probably tied up with how our society is structured, that parents are spending a lot of time working and perhaps not interacting with their children very much. And so those children are growing up not feeling particularly loved or wanted or desired. And so they will enter into the realm of sexuality very early because they want to feel loved. And so maybe that's a commentary about our inequality and how we treat the sexes differently again in American society. Um, Other things that may come up, I'm trying to remember if I've skipped anything. Again, access to healthcare. Do we provide healthcare evenly between the sexes? Sometimes there's a disparity there. Um, but again, what I want you to do when you're looking at the GII is go into the development chapter, and there's going to be a section in there that talks about gender inequalities in developing and developed countries and how that often appears in different ways. So if you will read that stuff over, I am sure that you will become an expert in gender inequality in developing around the world. Thanks for my TED Talk.